A billionaire hated noise until a 3-year-old's laughter changed his life forever. The Whitmore estate stood like a monument to isolation at the end of Riverside Drive, its limestone facade gleaming in the morning sun. From the outside, it was magnificent, a testament to wealth, taste, and architectural brilliance. From the inside, it was a mausoleum where the living walked on tiptoes. Alexander Whitmore had designed his life with the precision of a watchmaker. Every detail, every moment, every breath was calculated to maintain the perfect silence he craved. At 32, he had built an empire in tech, sold it for billions, and retreated into this fortress of solitude. The world saw a genius who had conquered Silicon Valley before most people finished graduate school. What they didn't see was a man who had systematically removed every source of unpredictability from his existence. The mansion's walls were lined with acoustic paneling disguised as elegant wainscoting. The floors were heated marble that never creaked. Even the grandfather clock in the entrance hall had been modified to tick so softly it was nearly inaudible. Alexander had fired 3 housekeepers in 6 months for crimes as minor as humming while they worked or wearing shoes that clicked against the stone floors. His days followed an unchanging rhythm. He woke at precisely 6 o'clock, worked in a soundproof study until noon, ate lunch prepared by a chef who knew to leave everything on warming trays before disappearing, then spent his afternoons reading in the library or walking the manicured grounds. Dinner was at 7. Bed at 10. No television, no music, no visitors. Just the whisper of pages turning and the distant sound of his own heartbeat. His therapist, one of the few people he still spoke to, had once asked him what he was running from. Alexander had terminated their sessions immediately. He wasn't running from anything. He had simply discovered that noise was the enemy of clarity and chaos the opposite of peace. In silence, he could think. In silence, he could exist without the abrasive friction of other people's needs, wants, and endless, exhausting emotions. Then Maria Hernandez walked into his life, and though he didn't know it yet, the foundations of his carefully constructed world began to tremble. Maria was different from the others he'd interviewed. She was 27, with warm brown eyes that held both determination and a hint of desperation. She needed the job. That much was clear from the way she sat forward in her chair during the interview, hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was a single mother, she explained, but her daughter was well-behaved and would never be a disruption. Her previous employer had provided a glowing recommendation. She understood the need for quiet and order. Alexander hired her because she seemed to understand the rules. She would come 3 times a week, clean the East Wing in the morning and the West Wing in the afternoon, and leave before dinner. She would be invisible, inaudible, a ghost who kept his kingdom pristine. For the first 2 weeks, the arrangement worked perfectly. Maria moved through the mansion like a whisper, her cleaning so thorough and unobtrusive that Alexander sometimes forgot she was there at all. She wore soft-soled shoes, never played music, and seemed to hold her breath when passing near his study. She was, in every way, exactly what he'd been searching for. He should have known perfection never lasts. It was a Tuesday morning in late September when everything changed. Alexander was in his study, reviewing quarterly reports from his investment portfolio, when he heard a sound he hadn't encountered in his home before, the unmistakable patter of small feet running across marble. He froze, his pen hovering above the paper. Then came another sound, one that seemed to crack through the air like lightning through still water. The high, bright peal of a child's laughter. Alexander's jaw tightened. He stood abruptly, the leather chair rolling backward, and strode toward the door. This was unacceptable. Maria had sworn, that her daughter would never be a disruption. This was exactly the kind of chaos he'd spent years eliminating from his life. He found them in the grand hallway, sunlight streaming through the tall windows and creating patterns on the floor. Maria was frantically trying to corral a tiny girl with wild, dark curls who was spinning in circles, arms outstretched, laughing with pure, uninhibited joy at the way her shadow danced on the walls. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Whitmore," Maria gasped, her face flushed with embarrassment and panic. The babysitter canceled last minute, and I couldn't find anyone else, and I thought I could keep her quiet in the staff room, but she got away from me. I'm so sorry. It won't happen again. Please, You're right, Alexander said coldly, cutting her off. It won't happen again. But he never finished the sentence. The little girl had stopped spinning and was staring directly at him with enormous brown eyes, so full of curiosity and life that something in his chest constricted painfully. She couldn't have been more than 3 years old, wearing a yellow dress with daisies on it that was already wrinkled from play. Hello, she said brightly, completely unafraid of the tall, stern man towering over her. I'm Sophia. I'm 3.5. Do you live in this big castle? Maria looked like she might cry. Sophia, sweetheart, we don't. Yes, Alexander heard himself say, the word emerging before his brain could stop it. I do. Sophia's face lit up with delight. It's beautiful. It has sunshine everywhere. Does it have a garden? Mama says gardens have butterflies, and I really, really want to see a butterfly. Alexander stood frozen, every instinct screaming at him to end this interaction, to send them both away, to restore the blessed silence. But something in the child's unguarded enthusiasm held him captive, like a man who had lived in darkness, so long he'd forgotten what light looked like. The logical thing, the only reasonable thing, would have been to fire Maria on the spot. Alexander had terminated employees for far less egregious violations of his peace. The rules were simple and non-negotiable: silence, order, predictability. A 3-year-old whirlwind represented the antithesis of everything his life stood for. Yet as he opened his mouth to deliver the dismissal, he found the words dying in his throat. Sophia was still looking at him with those impossibly bright eyes, waiting for an answer about the garden with the kind of earnest hope that seemed to belong to a different world entirely, a world he'd locked himself out of years ago. There is a garden, he heard himself saying stiffly. Through the French doors. In the conservatory. Can I see it? Sophia asked immediately, bouncing on her toes. Please, please, please. Sophia, no. Maria interjected quickly, her voice tight with stress. Mr. Whitmore is a very busy man, and we've already taken up too much of his time. We need to. 5 minutes, Alexander said abruptly, surprising himself as much as Maria. She can look at the garden for 5 minutes while you finish your work. Then you'll keep her in the staff room for the remainder of your shift. Maria's eyes widened with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Mr. Whitmore, I thank you. Thank you so much. I promise this won't. 5 minutes, he repeated firmly, already regretting the impulse even as something unfamiliar stirred in his chest, something that felt almost like curiosity. He led Sophia to the conservatory, acutely aware of her small presence beside him, the way she skipped rather than walked, the soft humming sound she made under her breath. The conservatory was his one concession to living beauty, a glass-enclosed paradise filled with orchids, jasmine, and a small fountain that burbled quietly in the corner. He spent an hour there each morning, finding something close to peace among the green-growing things. Sophia gasped when she saw it, and the sound was so genuine, so filled with wonder, that Alexander felt an unexpected tightness in his throat. It's like a fairy tale, she whispered, her voice dropped to a reverent hush that somehow seemed louder than her earlier laughter. Look at all the flowers. They're like rainbows growing from the ground. She moved through the space with careful steps, her small hands hovering near the blooms but not touching, as if she understood instinctively that beautiful things required gentleness. Alexander found himself watching her instead of the flowers, mesmerized by the play of expressions across her face, delight, awe, concentration, as she leaned close to smell a white orchid. My mama says flowers are happy plants, Sophia said, glancing back at him. Because they wear such pretty colors. Do you think they're happy here? It was such a simple question, the kind only a child would ask, yet it struck him with unexpected force. Were they happy? He'd never considered it. They were well-maintained, properly watered, given optimal light and temperature. But happy? I think so, he found himself answering. They seem to grow well here. That's good, Sophia said seriously. Everything should have a place where they can grow. She discovered the fountain then, and her delighted squeal echoed off the glass walls. Water. It's dancing water. She crouched beside it, watching the droplets cascade over smooth stones, and began to laugh again, that same pure, unreserved sound that had first disrupted his morning. Alexander felt something crack inside him, like ice beginning to thaw after a long winter. The sound should have grated on his nerves, should have sent him retreating to his study to nurse his irritation. Instead, he found himself listening, really listening, to the music of it. When had he last heard laughter? Real laughter, not the polite chuckles of business associates or the brittle social laughter of his parents' world. Years, he realized, not since before. He cut the thought off sharply, but it was too late. The memories were already surfacing, unbidden and unwelcome. Your 5 minutes are up, he said, his voice coming out harsher than he'd intended. Sophia looked up at him, and for a moment he thought she might cry, might dissolve into the kind of emotional scene he'd spent his life avoiding. But instead, she simply smiled and said, "Thank you for showing me the fairy garden. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." She stood, brushed off her dress, and without any prompting, held out her small hand to him. "My mama says when someone is nice to you, you should shake their hand and say thank you properly." Alexander stared at that tiny outstretched hand, so small it could have fit in his palm twice over. Something about the gesture, so formal yet so innocent, made his eyes sting. He found himself kneeling down to her level, something he couldn't remember doing for anyone, ever, and carefully taking her hand in his. "You're welcome, Sophia," he said quietly. Her hand was warm in his, and when she squeezed his fingers gently before letting go, he felt that crack in his chest widen just a little more. The rest of the day should have returned to normal. Maria kept Sophia sequestered in the staff room, and Alexander retreated to his study, determined to put the morning's disruption behind him. But he found himself unable to concentrate on his work. His mind kept wandering to the conservatory, to a little girl in a yellow dress discovering wonder in a fountain's dancing water. That evening, instead of his usual routine, he found himself standing in the conservatory long after the sun had set, looking at the flowers Sophia had admired. "Everything should have a place where they can grow," she'd said. Such simple wisdom from such a small person. He thought about his own life, about the silence he'd cultivated, the walls he'd built. He'd convinced himself it was a place to grow, to thrive away from the noise and pain of the world. But standing there in the darkness, surrounded by blooms he'd never really appreciated until a child pointed out their beauty, he wondered if he'd been wrong. Perhaps what he'd created wasn't a place to grow at all. Perhaps it was just a very beautiful cage. The babysitter crisis, as it turned out, was not a one-time emergency. When Maria arrived for her next shift, she brought Sophia again, this time with profuse apologies and the kind of exhausted desperation that only single parents know. "I understand if you need to let me go," Maria said, standing in the entrance hall with Sophia's hand clasped tightly in hers. "I've been trying to find reliable care, but everything fell through, and I can't afford to miss any more work. If you could just give me until the end of the week." Alexander should have said yes. Should have told her to collect her final paycheck and leave. It was the logical decision, the one that protected his peace and preserved his carefully ordered world. Instead, he heard himself say, "The same arrangement as last time. She stays in the staff room." Quietly. The relief on Maria's face was almost painful to witness. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. Thank you so much. I promise you won't even know she's here." But he did know. Even tucked away in the staff room with coloring books and toys, Sophia's presence seemed to fill the mansion in ways Alexander couldn't quite explain. He found himself listening for her, the soft patting of her feet when Maria let her stretch her legs, the occasional muffled giggle, the sweet sound of her voice asking her mother questions about everything and nothing. It was distracting. It was disruptive. It should have been intolerable. Instead, Alexander found himself inventing reasons to walk past the staff room. He told himself he was simply ensuring the rules were being followed, but that didn't explain why he slowed his pace near the door, or why something in his chest loosened when he caught fragments of Sophia's chatter. "Mama, why is the ceiling so high? Are there giants here? Mr. Alexander is very tall. Maybe he's a friendly giant like in my book. Does he have a magic harp? I should ask him." Despite himself, Alexander smiled. A friendly giant. It had been decades since anyone had described him as friendly in any context. On the third day of this new arrangement, he encountered Sophia in the hallway during what was supposed to be her supervised bathroom break. Maria had been called away momentarily by a cleaning emergency in the kitchen, a broken pipe that required immediate attention, and Sophia had apparently decided to do some exploring. She was standing in front of the Monet hanging in the west corridor, her neck craned back to look at the massive canvas, her expression one of intense concentration. "That's not the staff room," Alexander said from behind her. Sophia jumped slightly, but didn't seem frightened when she turned to face him. "I'm sorry," she said, sounding genuinely contrite. "I know I'm supposed to stay put, but I heard Mama running and I wanted to make sure she was okay, and then I saw this picture, and I had to stop because look," she turned back to the painting, pointing with one small finger. "The water looks like it's moving, but it's not moving at all. How did someone paint something that looks like it's alive?" Alexander found himself moving to stand beside her, looking at the painting he'd passed 1,000 times without really seeing. "The artist's name was Monet," he said. "He was interested in the way light changes how we see things. He painted the same scene over and over at different times of day. Because things look different in the morning than at night," Sophia said, nodding wisely. "Like how my night light makes my room look magical, but in the daytime it's just my regular room." "Exactly like that," Alexander said, surprised by the aptness of her comparison. They stood together in silence for a moment, looking at the painting. It was a comfortable silence, Alexander realized, not the rigid, enforced quiet of his usual days, but something softer, shared rather than imposed. "I like the purple flowers best," Sophia announced finally. "They look fuzzy. Do you have purple flowers in your fairy garden?" "I have some lavender," Alexander heard himself saying. "Would you like to see it?" He didn't know what possessed him to make the offer. This wasn't part of the agreement. This was, in fact, the opposite of what he'd stipulated. But Sophia's face lit up with such pure joy that he couldn't bring himself to retract the invitation. They went to the conservatory again, and this time Alexander found himself actually showing her things, explaining how the orchids needed less water than other plants, how the jasmine filled the air with perfume in the evenings, how the fountain was designed to create a specific kind of peaceful sound. Sophia listened with the intense focus that small children bring to things that genuinely interest them, asking questions that ranged from insightful to absurd. "Why don't the flowers talk to each other?" "They communicate in ways we can't hear. Through scent and the nutrients they share in the soil." "Do they get lonely?" Alexander paused, struck by the question. "I don't know. I'd never thought about it. I think maybe they do," Sophia said seriously. "That's why people should visit them and tell them they're beautiful, so they know someone cares." She proceeded to do exactly that, moving from plant to plant, complimenting each one with heartfelt sincerity. "You're very pretty, purple flower. I love your fuzzy leaves. And you, tall plant with the spots, you're beautiful too. Don't worry that you have spots. Spots are special." Alexander watched her, something warm and unfamiliar spreading through his chest. When was the last time he'd cared about anything the way this child cared about flowers she'd just met? When had he last allowed himself to express joy so freely, so completely, without calculation or restraint? Maria found them there 20 minutes later, her face pale with worry that transformed to shock when she saw her daughter and her employer sitting together on the stone bench, Sophia explaining in great detail about her stuffed rabbit at home who is also named after a flower. "Mr. Whitmore, I am so sorry," Maria began, but Alexander raised a hand to stop her. "It's fine," he said, and meant it. "We were discussing horticulture." "And rabbits," Sophia added helpfully. "And how Mr. Alexander's house is like a castle but probably doesn't have any dragons, which is good because I'm a little bit scared of dragons, but also a little bit sad because dragons would be exciting." That evening, after Maria and Sophia had left, Alexander sat in a study and tried to read, but the words kept blurring together. His mind was too full of purple flowers and a child's fearless joy, of questions he'd never thought to ask and observations that cut straight to truths he'd been avoiding for years. The silence of his mansion felt different now. Not peaceful, as he'd always told himself, but empty. The distinction had never seemed important before, but now it echoed through the halls like an accusation. What had he built here, really? A sanctuary or a tomb? Over the following weeks, Sophia's presence in the mansion became less of an emergency measure and more of an unspoken arrangement. Maria's childcare situation never quite stabilized, a rotation of unreliable sitters and last-minute cancellations that would have seemed suspicious if Alexander had been inclined to question it. He wasn't. Some part of him, a part he refused to examine too closely, had begun to look forward to Tuesdays and Thursdays and Saturdays, to the knowledge that his silent halls would be graced with the sound of small feet and innocent laughter. He told himself it was simply an acceptable disruption, that he was being practical. Maria was an excellent housekeeper, and good staff were hard to find. That Sophia was reasonably well-behaved for a child, staying mostly in designated areas and keeping her volume to tolerable levels. These were rational justifications, logical reasons for allowing the arrangement to continue. They were also lies, and Alexander had never been good at lying to himself. The truth was that Sophia was changing him in ways he couldn't quite articulate, cracking the ice that had encased his heart for so many years. She saw the world with such wonder, such unguarded enthusiasm, that it was impossible not to see it through her eyes, and in doing so, to remember that he'd once looked at life that way too, before he'd learned to be afraid of it. It started with small things. One morning, he found himself in the kitchen, a room he rarely entered since the chef handled all the meals, because he'd overheard Sophia tell her mother she loved cookies with chocolate chips. The chef had been startled to find Mr. Whitmore requesting that fresh cookies be available on days when Maria worked, placed on a plate in the staff room, for the employee and her daughter. Then there was the day he'd ordered a shipment of art supplies, high-quality colored pencils, sketch pads, watercolor sets, telling himself it was simply practical to give the child something quiet to do. When Maria had tried to thank him, stammering something about not expecting such generosity, he'd waved it away gruffly, claiming only that it was preferable to have her occupied with silent activities. But the truth was that he'd spent an hour in the conservatory the evening before, watching Sophia try to draw the flowers with the broken crayons from her mother's bag, frustrated because she couldn't quite capture the colors she saw. He'd lain awake that night thinking about it, then ordered the supplies first thing in the morning. Sophia's reaction when she discovered them had been worth every penny of the considerable expense. She'd actually squealed, a sound that would have sent him retreating to his study in irritation just weeks before, and thrown her arms around his legs in an impulsive hug that had frozen him in place, uncertain how to respond to such uncomplicated affection. "Thank you, thank you, thank you, Mr. Alexander," she'd cried, her face pressed against his knee. "These are the most beautiful colors I've ever seen. I'm going to draw you a picture of every flower in your fairy garden." She'd kept that promise with determined dedication, producing dozens of drawings that ranged from wildly abstract to surprisingly accurate. Alexander found himself looking forward to seeing what she'd created each day, and when Maria gently suggested that Sophia might want to take her artwork home, he'd quickly vetoed the idea. "They're studies of my plants," he'd said stiffly. "They should remain with their subjects." The truth was he couldn't bear the thought of the mansion returning to its previous state, walls decorated only with expensive art he'd bought for investment rather than love. Sophia's drawings brought something those pieces didn't. Joy, innocence, the proof that beauty could be found in imperfect things. He'd started having them framed, much to the surprise of his art curator, and hanging them in his private study where he could see them while he worked. There was something about looking up from spreadsheets and market analyses to see a wonky purple flower labeled lavender for Mr. Alexander that made the world seem less harsh somehow. The real shift came on a rainy Thursday in October. Alexander had been working in his study when he heard an unfamiliar sound, not laughter or running feet, but quiet sobbing. He found Sophia in the conservatory, curled up on the stone bench, tears streaming down her face while Maria crouched beside her, looking helpless and worried. What happened? The question emerged before he could stop it, his voice sharp with concern that surprised him. Maria looked up, her own eyes red-rimmed. I'm so sorry, Mr. Whitmore. She's upset about. It's nothing that should concern you. I'll take her to the staff room.
No.
Alexander heard himself say. Tell me what's wrong. Sophia looked up at him with those enormous brown eyes, now swimming with tears. My fish died, she hiccuped. Bubbles. He was my best friend, and now he's gone and I'll never see him again. And I didn't even get to say goodbye because Mama found him when I was asleep and he was already in fish heaven. It was such a small grief in the grand scheme of things. A goldfish, probably one at a carnival, likely only weeks old. But the pain on Sophia's face was real and raw, and Alexander felt it like a physical blow to his chest. He sat down on the bench beside her, something he'd never done for anyone in distress. Physical comfort wasn't something he understood or offered. Yet here he was, and here was this heartbroken child, and somehow the distance he usually maintained seemed not just unnecessary but cruel. I'm sorry about Bubbles, he said quietly. Losing someone we love is very hard. Sophia nodded miserably, wiping her nose on her sleeve. Mama says Bubbles is in heaven with the other fish, swimming in a big, beautiful pond with flowers all around. Do you think that's true? Alexander hesitated. He wasn't a religious man. He dealt in facts and figures, in things that could be proven and quantified. But looking at this child's tear-stained face, he understood that she wasn't asking for a theological debate. She was asking for comfort, for hope, for something to ease the sharp edges of her first real encounter with loss. I think, he said carefully, that if there's any justice in the universe, there's a place where small fish swim happily in clear water, surrounded by beauty. And I think Bubbles would want you to remember the joy he brought you, not just the sadness of losing him. Sophia considered this, her tears slowing. He did make me happy. He would do this funny thing where he'd swim up to the glass when I came home from daycare, like he was saying hello. And he liked when I sang to him. Then those are the important things, Alexander said. The memories of the happiness. They don't go away, even when we lose what we love. Something in his voice must have caught Maria's attention because she was looking at him strangely, her expression soft with understanding that made him uncomfortable. He realized he'd said more than he'd intended, revealed more than he'd meant to. But Sophia was leaning against his arm now, her small body warm and trusting, and he found he couldn't pull away. Could we have a funeral for Bubbles? She asked quietly. In your fairy garden? Mama buried him in a little box in the yard, but I want to say goodbye properly. Sophia, sweetheart, we can't ask Mr. Whitmore. Maria began, but Alexander interrupted. Yes, he said. We can have a funeral. And so they did. Alexander found himself standing in his conservatory that afternoon, watching a 3-year-old girl place a drawing of a goldfish beside the fountain, surrounded by purple flowers she'd carefully picked with his permission. Sophia said a few words about how Bubbles had been the best fish in the whole world and how she hoped he liked swimming in heaven. Maria cried quietly. And Alexander stood there, this man who had spent years avoiding emotion, feeling his eyes burn with tears he hadn't shed in over a decade. After Sophia had placed the last flower and said her final goodbye, she turned to Alexander and hugged him again, not the quick, impulsive embrace of a happy child, but something deeper, a gesture of gratitude and trust that pierced through every defense he'd built. Thank you for giving Bubbles a beautiful place to be remembered, she whispered. Alexander's arms, which had hung stiffly at his sides during her previous hug, slowly came up to return the embrace. It was awkward and uncertain, but it was real. That night, long after Maria and Sophia had gone home, Alexander sat in the conservatory, looking at the small memorial. Tomorrow, he would have the gardener create a proper marker, something tasteful but meaningful. Maybe a small stone with Bubbles engraved on it, surrounded by the purple flowers Sophia loved. He thought about what he'd told her, that memories of happiness didn't disappear when we lost what we loved. He'd meant it as comfort for her, but the words echoed back at him now, challenging the walls he'd built around his own heart. For the first time in years, he let himself remember why he'd created this silent sanctuary. He thought about the brother who should have been there to inherit their father's empire alongside him, about the car accident and the hospital room and the terrible, crushing silence that had followed, about how he'd learned that loving people meant risking the kind of pain that could break you, and how he'd decided never to risk it again. He'd thought that meant protection, safety, peace. But Sophia, with her innocent wisdom, was teaching him something different. That life without risk was life without joy. That silence could be a prison as easily as a sanctuary. That the walls built to keep out pain also kept out everything that made existence worth living. November arrived with early frost and shorter days, and with it came an invitation that Alexander had been dreading for months. His parents were hosting their annual Thanksgiving gala, a glittering affair attended by society's elite, politicians, business tycoons, and anyone wealthy enough to warrant inclusion. Alexander had managed to avoid it for the past 3 years, citing work obligations and health concerns, but his mother had made it clear that absence was no longer acceptable. "You're not a hermit, Alexander," she'd said during their monthly obligatory phone call. "You're a Whitmore. We have responsibilities to our position, whether we like it or not. I expect you there, and I expect you to be civil." Alexander had always despised these events, the false warmth, the calculating conversations, the way everyone smiled while mentally assessing your net worth and social utility. It was everything he'd escaped into his silent mansion to avoid. But his mother was right about one thing. He had responsibilities to the family name, obligations that couldn't be ignored forever. He was in his study, grimly reviewing his acceptance speech for an award he didn't want, when he heard the familiar sound of Sophia's arrival. It was a Tuesday, which meant Maria was there for her regular shift. Through the door, he could hear Sophia chattering excitedly about something. 15 minutes later, there was a soft knock. Alexander called out permission to enter, expecting Maria with a question about cleaning supplies or scheduling. Instead, Sophia poked her head around the door, her eyes bright with excitement. "Mr. Alexander," she said, using the name she'd adopted for him despite his never asking her to, "can I show you something?" He should have said no. He had work to do, a speech to write, a social obligation to prepare for. But he found himself nodding, setting down his pen. Sophia burst into the room properly, carrying a piece of paper with the careful reverence usually reserved for precious artifacts. "I made this at daycare," she announced proudly. "We're making turkey pictures for Thanksgiving, and we're supposed to write what we're thankful for on the feathers. I wrote about you." She held up the construction paper turkey, which was decorated with feathers in various colors. Alexander's eyes went to the purple one, where Sophia had written in careful, uneven letters, "Mr. Alexander, who has the fairy garden and makes Mama smile." Something in his chest clenched painfully. "I make your mother smile?" "Oh yes," Sophia said seriously. "She used to cry a lot when she thought I was sleeping because she was worried about money and stuff. But now she smiles more. She says you're a good man, even if you try to hide it." Alexander didn't know what to say to that. He was saved from responding by Sophia's continuation of her Thanksgiving report. "We're going to have turkey at my abuela's house," she said. "All my cousins will be there, and there will be so much food and music and laughing. It's my favorite day ever. What are you doing for Thanksgiving?" "I have to attend a party," Alexander said, unable to keep the distaste from his voice. Sophia's face lit up. "A party? With decorations and games and cake?" "Not quite. It's a formal dinner, with speeches and business discussions and—" He trailed off, seeing her confusion. "How did you explain to a 3-year-old that not all gatherings were joyful? That some parties were more like elaborate performances where everyone played a part?" "That doesn't sound like a very fun party," Sophia said, her nose wrinkling. "Will there be any kids there?"
"No."
"No children."
"Oh."
She considered this gravely. "Then who will remind the grown-ups to have fun?" The question was so earnest, so genuinely puzzled, that Alexander felt something inside him shift. Out of the mouths of babes, as the saying went.
"Who indeed?"
"That's a very good question, Sophia." She beamed at him, then noticed the papers on his desk. Are you doing homework? I have homework too sometimes. Would you like to do homework together? And so Alexander found himself spending the next hour with a 3-year-old companion, both of them working on their respective tasks. Sophia colored diligently in her workbook while Alexander revised his speech, and somehow the presence of the small child made the tedious work less burdensome. Every so often, Sophia would share an observation about her coloring, about a bird she saw through the window, about whether clouds ever got tired of floating, and Alexander would respond, finding himself drawn into conversations he'd never imagined having. When Maria came to collect her daughter, she apologized for the intrusion, but Alexander waved it away. She wasn't bothering me, he said, and realized it was true. In fact, he'd been more productive in the last hour than he had all morning. After they left, Alexander sat in the silence of his study and thought about Sophia's turkey and her simple gratitude. When was the last time he'd genuinely felt thankful for anything? When had he last looked at his life and seen blessings instead of carefully managed assets? The Thanksgiving gala loomed, and for the first time, Alexander found himself questioning not just his attendance, but everything it represented. The life he'd built, the walls he'd erected, the person he'd become. Was this really who he wanted to be? A man so isolated that a child's laughter felt like a foreign language? The day of the gala arrived cold and clear. Alexander dressed in his custom tuxedo, fixed his cufflinks, and stared at his reflection in the mirror. He looked like his father, same sharp features, same calculating eyes, same expression of distant superiority. The realization turned his stomach. The drive to his parents' estate took 40 minutes, during which Alexander rehearsed polite small talk and reminded himself of names and faces he'd need to remember. The mansion blazed with lights, and luxury cars lined the circular driveway. Everything was exactly as it had always been, perfect, polished, and utterly soulless. He made it through the first hour on autopilot, shaking hands and accepting congratulations on the award he'd be receiving. The ballroom was filled with Boston's elite, all dressed in their finest, all wearing the same mask of cultured sophistication that hid whatever genuine emotions might lurk beneath. His mother found him during cocktail hour, resplendent in emeralds and disapproval. "You're here," she said, as if his presence was both expected and somehow disappointing. "Try to mingle, Alexander. The Sandersons are here, and their daughter just finished her MBA. Very accomplished girl. You should speak with her." Translation: Here's a suitable woman from an appropriate family. Perform your social duty and make connections that matter. Alexander opened his mouth to decline, but at that moment, someone jostled his elbow, and his champagne sloshed onto his sleeve. Apologies were offered, laughter rippled through the nearby group, and the noise of it, the false, performative quality of it, suddenly felt unbearable. He thought of Sophia's laughter in the conservatory, genuine and free. He thought of her asking who would remind the grown-ups to have fun at a party with no children. And he realized with sudden, crystal clarity that he couldn't do this anymore. He couldn't be this person, in this place, pretending that any of this mattered. "Excuse me," he said to his mother, setting down his glass. "I need to leave." "Alexander, don't be ridiculous. You haven't even." "I'm sorry, Mother, but I need to go." He left her standing there, shocked into silence, and made his way through the crowd. People called his name, tried to stop him for conversations, but he moved with purpose toward the exit. His father intercepted him at the door, face red with barely contained anger. "Where do you think you're going?" he demanded. "You can't just walk out of." "Yes," Alexander said quietly. "I can." And he did. The drive back to his mansion should have felt like retreat, like failure. Instead, Alexander felt something in his chest loosening, like a knot finally coming undone. He'd spent years thinking he was protecting himself, keeping the world at arm's length to avoid pain. But Sophia had shown him the truth. He wasn't protecting himself. He was just hiding. When he arrived home, the mansion was dark and silent. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, it felt empty, the way it had always been empty, though he'd been too afraid to admit it. Alexander walked through the halls to the conservatory, his footsteps echoing in the quiet. The plants were there, thriving under his careful maintenance, but something was missing. He thought of Sophia moving among them, telling each one it was beautiful, making sure they knew someone cared. He sat on the stone bench and let himself feel what he'd been avoiding for so long, the crushing loneliness of a life lived in silence, the ache of connection denied, the pain of love refused before it could even be offered. And for the first time in over a decade, Alexander Whitmore allowed himself to cry. The Friday after Thanksgiving, Alexander woke to find the world transformed by snow. It had fallen silently during the night, blanketing the estate grounds in pristine white that sparkled under the pale morning sun. He stood at his bedroom window, coffee in hand, watching the way the light caught on the ice crystals, and thought about how Sophia would react to seeing it. She would probably want to make a snowman, he thought, and then caught himself smiling at the image. 3 months ago, the idea of a child disrupting his carefully maintained grounds would have been unthinkable. Now he found himself actively hoping that Maria would bring her daughter today, that he might get to see Sophia's face light up at the winter wonderland outside. He wasn't scheduled to receive a cleaning service today. Maria only came on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, but when the doorbell rang mid-morning, Alexander found himself hoping it might be them anyway. Instead, he opened the door to find his mother, dressed in a cashmere coat and wearing an expression that suggested she'd come to deliver an unpleasant verdict. "May I come in?" she asked, though it wasn't really a question. Alexander stepped aside, allowing her entry into the mansion she'd visited perhaps twice in the 3 years since he'd bought it. She looked around the entrance hall, with the critical eye of someone assessing value and finding it wanting. "You left the gala," she said without preamble. "You embarrassed your father and me in front of everyone who matters in the city. I think I deserve an explanation." "I'm sorry for any embarrassment," Alexander said carefully. "But I couldn't stay. I don't belong in that world anymore." His mother's laugh was sharp and brittle. "Don't be dramatic, Alexander. You're a Whitmore. That world is your birthright, whether you like it or not." "No," he said quietly. "It's not. I've spent the last several years thinking that if I could just control my environment enough, eliminate all the variables and the noise and the unpredictability, I'd find peace. But I was wrong. I wasn't finding peace. I was just not living." "This is about your brother," his mother said, her voice tight. "You're still wallowing in grief like a child. It's been 15 years, Alexander. It's time to move on." The words should have hurt. A few months ago, they would have sent him retreating into defensive anger. But standing in his entrance hall, with Sophia's drawing of purple flowers visible through the study doorway, Alexander found he wasn't angry. He was just tired of pretending. "I'm not wallowing," he said. "I've been hiding. From grief, yes, but also from joy, from connection, from anything that might make me feel something real. And I don't want to hide anymore." His mother stared at him as if he'd begun speaking a foreign language. What brought on this revelation? Alexander thought about how to explain it. About a little girl with wild dark curls who'd invaded his silence and refused to be intimidated by his walls. About laughter that sounded like music and questions that cut straight to truths he'd been avoiding. About learning that happiness wasn't found in the absence of noise, but in the presence of life. "I met someone who reminded me what matters," he said simply. His mother's expression shifted from confusion to something like hope. "You're seeing someone? Alexander, that's wonderful. Why didn't you bring her to the gala? We would have been delighted." "She's 3 years old," Alexander interrupted. "The daughter of my housekeeper. She's taught me more about living in the past 3 months than I've learned in the last 15 years. The hope drained from his mother's face, replaced by something that looked almost like pity. "Alexander, you can't build a life around someone else's child. That's not healthy. If you want a family—" "I don't know what I want yet," he said. "But I know I can't go back to living the way I was. The silence, the isolation, the careful control of everything, it wasn't protecting me. It was killing me, slowly. I'm grateful to Sophia for showing me that." They talked for another hour, his mother trying various angles to convince him that his epiphany was really just another form of retreat, that he needed to re-engage with society, that he was making decisions based on sentiment rather than sense. Alexander listened patiently, but he'd made up his mind. The old life, the old Alexander, was done. After his mother left, disappointed and worried, Alexander found himself drawn to the conservatory. The snow outside made the glass room feel like its own world, warm and green while winter pressed against the windows. He thought about what changes he wanted to make, how he might begin to open his life to the possibility of connection, of community, of something more than the beautiful emptiness he'd created. The answer came to him as he stood among the flowers Sophia had so lovingly catalogued in her drawings. He pulled out his phone and called Maria. "Mr. Whitmore?" She answered with obvious surprise. It was the first time he'd ever called her outside of scheduling discussions. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is fine," he assured her. "I wanted to ask you something. I know you have family in the area. If you needed more hours, more stable work, would you be interested?" There was a long pause. "Sir, I don't understand. Are you offering me more shifts?" "I'm offering you a full-time position," Alexander said. "Not just as a housekeeper but as a house manager. This place is too large for one person, and I've been thinking about opening it up more, maybe hosting events, having people over."
I'll need help with that.
The salary would be commensurate with the expanded role, of course, and there would be benefits. Health insurance, retirement contributions, paid time off. Another pause, longer this time. When Maria spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "Mr. Whitmore, that's incredibly generous. But what about Sophia? I still haven't found reliable childcare, and I couldn't commit to full-time hours unless—" "Bring her with you," Alexander interrupted. "Every day if you need to. I'll have the small library converted into a proper playroom. We can hire a part-time nanny to help supervise her while you work. Whatever you need." The silence on the other end stretched so long that Alexander wondered if he'd overstepped, if his offer sounded as desperate and strange as he suddenly feared it might. But then Maria spoke, and she was definitely crying now. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "I'm just your housekeeper. Sophia is just a child who's been disrupting your peace for months. Why would you?" "Because you're not just anything," Alexander said quietly. "And neither is Sophia. She's changed my life, Maria. Changed me. I spent years building walls to keep the world out, and your daughter knocked them down with nothing but honesty and joy and purple flowers. I owe her more than I can ever repay. This is a start." Maria accepted, of course. They worked out the details over the following week, and by the time Tuesday arrived, the small library had been transformed. The books remained. Alexander couldn't bear to remove them. But now they shared space with toys and art supplies, a small table perfect for coloring, and a window seat with cushions where a little girl could read or nap or watch the birds in the garden. Sophia's reaction to the playroom was everything Alexander had hoped for. She'd run from corner to corner, exclaiming over each new discovery, before throwing herself into his arms with such force that he actually stumbled backward. "It's the most beautiful room in the whole world," she declared. "Even more beautiful than the fairy garden, and I didn't think anything could be more beautiful than that." Over the following weeks, the mansion began to change in ways both subtle and profound. The silence that had once been absolute was now punctuated regularly by Sophia's laughter, her questions, her running commentary on everything she discovered. Alexander found himself adjusting his schedule to coincide with her presence, working in a study with the door open so he could hear her play, taking breaks to show her something in the conservatory or to answer her endless questions about how things worked. He taught her about the grandfather clock, explaining the mechanism of weights and pendulums. She taught him about her favorite cartoons, explaining with great seriousness why each character was important. He showed her how to identify different types of birds that visited the feeders he'd installed, another new addition. She showed him how to make up songs about absolutely everything, from breakfast cereal to the patterns in the marble floor. Maria watched these interactions with something like wonder, seeing her employer transform from the stern, silent man who'd interviewed her into someone warmer, more open. Someone who smiled regularly and laughed, actually laughed, at her daughter's jokes. "You're different," she said one day when Sophia was occupied with her coloring books. Happier, I think. I am, Alexander admitted. I didn't realize how much I'd been missing until Sophia showed up and made it impossible to ignore anymore. The changes weren't limited to his interactions with Sophia. Alexander found himself reaching out to old friends he'd cut off, accepting invitations he would have previously declined. He started a weekly dinner gathering, inviting colleagues and acquaintances to the mansion for meals that filled the dining room with conversation and laughter. He donated to local charities, got involved with educational programs, began using his wealth for more than just generating more wealth. He even reconciled with his parents, though the relationship remained complicated. His mother still didn't understand his choices, but she'd begun to accept them, especially after meeting Sophia and seeing firsthand the effect the child had on her son. She's special, his mother had admitted grudgingly after Sophia had given her a detailed tour of the conservatory, explaining each plant's name and personality. I've never met a child so present. She listens like every word matters. She does, Alexander had agreed. She taught me that every moment matters, if we're brave enough to pay attention. Winter deepened, and the mansion that had once been a monument to isolation became something else, a home. Not perfect or neat or silent, but alive in ways that mattered more than perfection ever could. On Christmas Eve, Alexander did something he'd never done before. He hosted a party. Not a gala or formal dinner, but a genuine celebration, with decorations that Sophia had helped choose, music that made people smile instead of serving as background noise for business deals, and guests who were there because they wanted to be, not because of social obligation. Maria and Sophia were among the guests of honor. Sophia wore a red velvet dress and spent the evening showing everyone her favorite spots in the house, particularly the conservatory, which Alexander had filled with white lights that made it look like a fairy tale. At one point, Alexander found himself standing in the doorway of the ballroom, watching the gathering. Sophia was dancing with one of the guests, spinning in circles and laughing with that pure, unreserved joy that had first cracked his carefully constructed walls. The sound of it, of her happiness, of the guests' conversations, of music and laughter and life, filled the space that had been silent for so long. Maria came to stand beside him, following his gaze to where her daughter twirled and jumped. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for all of this. For seeing her, really seeing her, when most people in your position would have just seen a disruption." "I did see a disruption," Alexander admitted. "But I was wrong about what that meant. I thought disruption was the enemy. I didn't understand that sometimes we need to be disrupted, shaken out of the patterns we've built, forced to see the world differently." He paused, watching Sophia convince another guest to join her impromptu dance party.
She saved me, Maria.
"I was so busy building a perfect life that I forgot to actually live." She reminded me what that means. Later that evening, after most of the guests had gone home and Sophia was drowsing on the couch, wrapped in a blanket and fighting sleep to squeeze out every last moment of the magical night, Alexander sat beside her. "Did you have a good time?" he asked softly. Sophia nodded, her eyes drifting closed. "The best time ever. Your house isn't lonely anymore, Mr. Alexander. It's full of happy sounds now." "Yes," he agreed, his throat tight with emotion. "It is." "That's good," Sophia murmured, burrowing deeper into her blanket. "Houses should have happy sounds. So should people." She fell asleep then, there on his couch, and Alexander sat beside her while Maria gathered their things. When Maria came to collect her daughter, Alexander found himself reluctant to let them go, to return the mansion to silence even temporarily. "You're both welcome to stay," he heard himself say. "I have more than enough guest rooms. It's late, and the roads might be icy." Maria looked surprised but touched. "Are you sure? We don't want to impose." "You're not imposing," Alexander said firmly. "You're your family, if you want to be." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Family. Not employee and employer, not charity and recipient, but something real and chosen and important. Maria's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling.
"We'd be honored," she said.
That night, the mansion held 3 people instead of 1. Sophia slept in one of the guest rooms, tucked under blankets in a bed far too large for her small form. Maria slept in the adjoining room, grateful and hopeful and happy. And Alexander sat in his study, listening to the soft sounds of people breathing in other parts of his house, and felt a peace he'd never known in all his years of silence. The next morning was Christmas, and Alexander woke early to find Sophia already awake, peering out the window at fresh snow with wonder in her eyes. They made breakfast together, or rather, Alexander made breakfast while Sophia helped by narrating every action and asking approximately 1,000 questions about how pancakes worked. After breakfast, they opened presents in the conservatory, surrounded by flowers and morning light. Alexander had bought Sophia a proper easel and professional art supplies, along with books about famous painters. She'd made him something with Maria's help, a photo album filled with pictures of the mansion, of the conservatory, of moments from the past few months. The last page held a drawing of 2 figures, one tall, one small, standing in a garden full of purple flowers. Above it, in Sophia's careful handwriting, were the words, "Mr. Alexander and me. Friends forever." Alexander had to excuse himself for a moment, overcome by emotions he'd suppressed for so long that feeling them now was almost painful in its intensity. When he returned, Sophia hugged him tightly, and he hugged her back, no longer awkward or uncertain, but with the natural affection of someone who'd learned that love given freely multiplied rather than diminished. In the weeks and months that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. Sophia continued to grow and learn, filling the mansion with her questions and laughter. Maria managed the household with skill and grace, bringing her own warmth to every corner. And Alexander continued his transformation, learning daily what it meant to be part of something larger than himself. He never did return to his parents' galas, though he maintained a cordial relationship with them. He used his wealth differently now, funding programs that mattered rather than investments that merely generated returns. He made friends, real friends, who valued him for who he was becoming rather than what he owned. But the most important change was the simplest one. He allowed himself to love and be loved, to connect and be connected, to be vulnerable in ways that terrified him but also made him feel more alive than he'd ever been. On Sophia's 4th birthday, Alexander threw her a party in the conservatory, her fairy garden, as she still called it. Children ran and played and laughed, their joy echoing off the glass walls, and Alexander stood in the middle of it all, smiling at the beautiful chaos. Maria found him there, watching her daughter blow out candles, surrounded by friends. "Are you okay?" she asked, knowing him well enough now to recognize the emotion in his eyes. "I'm better than okay," Alexander said. "I'm happy. Really, genuinely happy. I'd forgotten what that felt like." "She has that effect on people," Maria said, watching Sophia with the deep love only a mother knows. "She sees the good in everyone. She saw it in you when you were trying so hard to hide it." "She's remarkable," Alexander agreed. "You both are." As the party continued around them, as children shrieked with laughter and adults chatted over cake, as Sophia's joy filled every corner of the mansion that had once been a tomb of silence, Alexander understood the truth that had been there all along. Happiness wasn't found in perfect control or pristine silence or the absence of disruption. Happiness was found in the mess and the noise, in the unexpected moments and unplanned connections, in opening your heart even when it scared you, in allowing yourself to be changed by the people brave enough to love you. It was found in a little girl's laughter echoing through empty halls, transforming them into something warm and alive. It was found in learning that the greatest luxury wasn't silence at all. It was the sound of home. Years later, when Sophia was grown and making her own way in the world, she would look back on those early years in the mansion and marvel at the transformation she'd witnessed. The stern, silent man who'd first looked at her with such disapproval had become one of the most important people in her life. Not a father, exactly, but something equally precious. A guardian, a mentor, a friend who'd chosen to be family. And Alexander, now in his 50s and finally at peace with himself, would look at the woman Sophia had become, kind, creative, fearless in her joy, and know that she'd given him the greatest gift anyone could receive. She'd taught him how to live. The mansion still stood at the end of Riverside Drive, but it was no longer a fortress of isolation. Its halls echoed with laughter and conversation, its rooms filled with people who mattered. The conservatory remained Sophia's favorite place, and she visited often, bringing her own children to see the fairy garden and to hear stories about the lonely man who'd been saved by a little girl's courage to simply be herself. Because that's what it had taken in the end. Not grand gestures or dramatic interventions, but the simple, revolutionary act of one small person refusing to let silence win. Of choosing joy over fear, connection over isolation, love over the safe but empty alternative. And in doing so, she'd reminded Alexander, and anyone who knew their story, that we're all one choice away from transformation, one connection away from hope, one moment away from remembering that we were never meant to live in silence, but in the beautiful, chaotic, precious noise of being truly, fully alive.